invited Steve to Belgium, and I still remember that workshop. It was a fairly big crowd, 70, 80 people in the hospital, and he talked a little bit, but we decided we'll ask him to do 2 live consultations with patients. So I had one of my families I've been working with were so nice to me and they were able to speak English, so they invited them, and Steve had a talk with them. And I still remember so he did this conversation. It was a very heavy family, misery, and I don't even remember the story, which is irrelevant. But everybody in this room, he saw Steve talking to these people, and all of a sudden it was as if they became lighter. It was very strange. I was looking at my patients and I was like, what the heck is happening here? But something was happening. And they after 3/4 an hour or something, they left the room and they were very happy, and they had all kind of plans. I don't remember the content. Yeah. And of course then there was the classical post-mortem. Yeah. Steve sitting on his table, wigging his feet, and questions. Now this is, I think, 87, Flanders, Belgium. A foreigner comes and he asks questions, and then nobody says, everybody goes, looks at his shoes. So I thought, well, I have to say something. So I stood up and I said, Steve, it was very interesting. And I started a classic systemic analysis of what happened. Yeah. I still remember, and everybody was, I mean, they were all students, who were all thinking on those lines. And Steve was looking at me, and I maybe talked for 2-3 minutes, which is a very long time. And then he looked me in the eye and said, Louis, you work too hard. Next question. I was angry. I was angry. I hate him. I hate him. Yeah. But that was one of the first moments for me personally that I really thought there is something special here. So, and then that's how we landed in Belgium, and then Luc was traveling a lot to France because he taught a lot of family therapy in France. And then we invited him to Paris, and I was doing stuff in Holland, and I invited him to Holland, and so it spread, and then after a few years we also invited Insoo. But Insoo was, I think, we invited Insoo in the first time. I'm not totally sure, but I think 91 or 92 something. Yeah, it was all Steve that was. Yeah, very strange, very strange. I'm so happy that I've met those people. I think Steve's legacy really is that he gave us another paradigm. We all come and we're all trained, and still today psychiatry, etc., is still very cause-effect oriented. Yeah, what's the root cause? Take it away, and etc. And he showed that you don't need to have a problem to find a solution, and the solution that the client can be helped to find himself, because the client needs help. Otherwise, he cannot find his own solutions. Because if he could, he would not have become client. Yeah, so you only become client when you're stuck with your, when you lose your own possibility of using your own resources. Yeah. And I think that's, for me, that's the essence of solution-focused approach. And the techniques only they're just gimmicks. Important gimmicks in those years, but nowadays more of a gimmick, even in such a manner that the solution-focused approach tends to become reduced to what I always call the gang of four. In every session, and always, miracle question. In every session, at least one scaling question, preferably more. The only thing you have to do is ask for exceptions to the problems and then just bombard people with compliments. I call that the gang of four, because if you do that, you simplify ad absurdum, the rich epistemology that is behind the solution-focused way of thinking and doing. But that's my opinion. To be frank, I personally was not impressed by Steve's excellent psychotherapeutic skills. I was not very impressed with him. He was not a flamboyant kind of therapist, or that's not what impressed me. What impressed me was his real Occam's razor-like way of thinking about things, and the ability he had to really skip everything that was unnecessary. Now, again, remember, we're talking mid and end of 80s. The solution-focused way of thinking is now almost into the DNA of psychology, yeah, or certain aspects. I give you an example that really impressed me, and it's a famous case, and he told that case before the video was made. He told the story about, just to say how simple, but also how a word he hated, how profound he could work. He hated the word profound. Yeah. Yeah. So he tells a story. There is a lady comes in, and she looks very tired, black eyes, yeah, and her hair is not. And then she comes in and she says, "Are you sure nobody can hear us? There are no cameras around. I have to tell you a story." And then she tells his story. She says, I'm a secretary, and I work at a large meat factory just out of town. And the last year, I live not in my place, but in an apartment of one of my good friends, who is married to a businessman, and they're living for 3 years in Europe as expats. And my friend said, "You know what? Why wouldn't you come and live in our apartment? And it's 4 times as big as my apartment, and I don't make so much money, so I can rent out my own apartment." And my friend said, "You can live there for free. To just take care of the plants of the cat, yeah, and so that the apartment is not empty." And Steve then, in his typical style, with his, yeah, he goes like, yeah. He doesn't really look at the client. He just, And she says, "But the last few months are terrible. I have one apartment above me, that's the loft. And since 4 months, there is a guy who moved in, and he has a machine." And Steve goes, "Oh, typical. I can't do it." But everybody who's ever met Steve knew his style. Yeah. He doesn't really look at her in the eye, but yeah. And then she said, and oh, you know what, this machine, when I go to sleep, he puts on his machine, and then he kind of beams, so I can't sleep. And I'm totally exhausted. Now, if you hear this story and you're a psychiatrist, I mean, the diagnosis pops up, yeah. But Steve just listens and says, "I've tried everything," yeah, without even Steve having to ask, "What have you tried to do?" Or are there some moments that he doesn't there, is not there, asking for exceptions? He just goes, I've tried everything. I even moved very quietly. I went into the bed, made noise, so that he knew where I was, and then I very silently crept, and I went to sleep in the kitchen where I already prepared the mattress. Didn't work. Didn't work. This machine, it can't follow me. Steve goes, And she said, "A few weeks ago, I was with him in the elevator, and he was talking to the phone with someone, and they were discussing that he went for a weekend skiing something, I don't know what, yeah. So I knew that next weekend he would be out of the house. And I've waited all week long and didn't sleep. I mean, it was really very, very bad, yeah. And then I waited for him in the garage when he came. I took half a day off. So I sat waiting, and he came with his Porsche and he drove, and then I waited and waited to see him get his stuff, load all his holiday weekend stuff in the car, and he moved out. And I actually followed him 4 cars behind, so that I was sure that he left town and that he went on the highway. And then I went home and I thought, yes, now I will sleep. Didn't work. He has an automated machine. Yeah. And then Steve said something. It's a kind of 6-7 minutes, very strange. Yeah? Yeah. And then Steve said something in the style of, so if I understand correctly, you have a sleeping disorder. And then the rest of the session goes, I think he asked a miracle question, or but nothing comes out of it. So, do I understand correctly that you have a sleeping disorder? Yeah, and the rest is just, okay. Now, next session, yeah, Steve tells this story and says, okay, I see her back in 2 or 3 weeks. And she comes in and she says, I've got him. And she's really energized. I've got him. Yeah. And Steve goes, And she says, you know what? I was thinking about this sleeping disorder. And while I was driving home, and you're correct. It's just a sleeping disorder I have. Yeah. So if I could sleep, really sleep, my problem would be solved. So what did I do? My boss was out of the country for a week, and I took all kind of stuff with me to my office, and I waited until everybody left the office building. I left with them. Then I went to a restaurant, had a good meal, and I went to sleep for 3 nights in the office. And I was a different person. Yeah. I was a different person, but I thought my boss is coming back. I'm not going to sleep in my office, and I refuse to go back in my own apartment. Yeah, I refuse to do that. So I drive home, and there is a block in the road, and I have to take a shortcut, and I stand at a red light, and all of a sudden I see a camping store where they sell tents and stuff, and I thought, well, I'm going to have a vacation and go camping with my daughter in summer, and there are special prices. I'm going to see if I can't buy something that I need, a sleeping sack or something. And then Steve goes, So she says, so I'll go into the shop, and there was all kind of stuff for camping, but there was also a department, a part of the store that was where you could buy screwdrivers, nails, that kind of stuff. Yeah. And all of a sudden, I remember I looked at the television at National Geographic, what you have to do when you're in the Midlands and a storm comes. You have to never leave your car, sit in the car, because it's a cage, a Faraday cage. So you cannot get electrocuted, because it's a Faraday. And all of a sudden it dawned on me. So I went to the guy, I said, give me copper. The best and the thickest. And he brought me a bowl of copper, and I went home, and I knew I had him. So I went home, and immediately I went to my bedroom in the apartment of and that was a typical American bed with posts, yeah, in copper. And I screwed these bolts a little loose. I put some copper around, and I made a Faraday cage. So I said, okay, so how much do I owe you? And she left. So Steve told that story, and I saw that half of the room having something like this is simplissimo. What is this? This is stupid. Yeah, this is what has this to do with This is a sick woman, and I thought that's genius. He just took this description and took one part, made a question out of it, and asked her. So, correct me if I'm wrong, which is a question. You have a sleeping disorder. And this was the only resource that he gave back to her. And then, of course, the rest of the story happened. So I was very impressed with that. Because I didn't understand it. In the beginning, I heard that story maybe, I don't know, 30 years ago, him telling this. I thought, well, I didn't know what to make out of it. So that was for me one of the most impressive things with Steve. His very sharp thinking. I was not impressed by his way of relating to I mean, people who have known Steve personally knew he was a little bit awkward in social contact. Yeah. It took us 5 or 6 or 7 years of having him once or twice a year, and we were always there when he came. Before we had a conversation about anything else than what kind of beer would you like, yeah. So he was not very talkative. That was that's what I learned from Steve. Much more than all these techniques stuff. He was in those days, in the beginning of the 90s, he was very deep into Wittgenstein. Yeah. Well, I didn't understand the word. Obviously I've read. I'm an academic. An intellectual, obviously, I've read Wittgenstein. It's all nice sentences, but I really didn't understand the essence of it. But Steve could talk about that, and it was his style of doing therapy, I think. And he was an experimenter. He had these ideas of almost linguistically dissecting what happened within the constructions of reality that the patient created in themselves. Yeah. I was very impressed. And it was always the same. When you saw Steve doing live sessions, yeah, not like the videotapes, they're all role played, yeah. But I've seen him do many live sessions. I even had many live sessions, not so many, but maybe 15, 20 live sessions when there was no audience. It was interesting to see that when there was an audience, there was always the miracle question and the scaling question, always. He was not so good with compliments, because that's why they developed this break, yeah. So they made the break. That was standard operating procedure. Then they went have some coffee, and yeah, and then they came back, and then he delivered a compliment and a message. He was not so complimenting in the regular contact. Yeah. I've seen him many, and Insoo also. I will talk a little bit Insoo later. But I've sat in sessions where Steve didn't use a scaling question, didn't use a miracle question. And when post-mortem of the session, I asked him, how come? He said, oh, it's too complicated, it's not necessary here. So there is this myth that they always, which in reality was not true. Yeah. On stage, yes. In the books, yes. On videotapes, yes. Because that's what the audience wants to hear. Yeah. When you go to a concert of the Rolling Stones, you want them to play the old songs. Yeah? And they can do a tap dance or do a 14th century madrigal. They're all people, and they can do whatever they please. But you want them to play Can Get No Satisfaction. With Steve, it was the same. Yeah? But in reality, it was not always the case that they used the technique.